So we appreciate your faith in us, but I personally did not understand 3 of the words in the resolution, and I think I might be in a boat with other members of the team. So we wanted to give you a disclaimer so you had an idea of what you were about to watch. Good luck. Try not to cry.
Yeah. Okay, come on. Come on, Garrett.
Sure.
Oh, gosh.
Wait, so I'm going first now?
Yeah.
Okay. I'd rather get this over with.
Sure.
Come on, we gotta be more positive, guys.
I'm positive about debate in general. I'm just not positive about this round.
Okay.
Can someone remind me of BP times?
7. That's all you need to know. Okay. Alana, are you ready?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Honorable Speaker, today's economy is more connected than ever, and we cannot rely on conservative isolationist policies to bring the world into economic growth and prosperity. What this House proposes is that central banks should consider the impacts on foreign economies when setting monetary policy. And we have 2 reasons why. One, because the global economy is more and more interconnected and interdependent. And second, that central banks have an obligation to all people because it benefits both the domestic economy and the world economy as a whole. So first, as the opening government, we don't really have necessarily a burden to set the monetary policy. All we need to show is that it's important for central banks to consider the impacts on foreign economies, and by considering it, in essence, we need to prove that will be beneficial for them. So our first main point, why the global economy is more interconnected. So what we see today is that globalism has spread, and every single economy is dependent on each other, and there's all foreign currencies are matched against other currencies, and some are tied, and pretty much money all around the world is interconnected, and one policy in one country can affect another one. For example, in 2008, when the American housing market crashed and all the banks had to be bailed out, that fucked over every single other country in the world, became into one of the largest recessions since the Great Depression, and it fucked over Greece, it fucked over the EU, and in the end, no one won because of a domestic policy failure. And so when the central banks of the United States were setting this policy, they probably didn't consider what was going to be the gross ramifications around the world, and the impacts that it had on both on the impacts of how the effects seen around the world would impact their domestic citizens. Moreover, you can see this happening. This is just one example of a singular economy affecting the rest of the world, but this has happened countless times in recent history, and that's the reason why, first, that foreign economies affect domestic economies, and second, why domestic central banks should care about foreign economies, because it affects them and their constituents. Moving on to the second point on how. The second point on it's basically the warrant, Charlotte. Why banks should care not just about domestic citizens but also foreign citizens, because when you look at where the United States get its goods, right? We get a lot of our goods from China or Bangladesh or even Mexico, and if our policy is creates something that necessarily benefits our economy but not theirs, then their economy will struggle more and will be more difficult to trade and get the goods that Americans require of us, or what Americans need and want and demand. So for example, if central banks set a tariff against a specific nation that benefits domestic goods but not foreign goods, the outcome of this is that we have less trade between that nation to preserve domestic markets. However, it might be more beneficial that we preserve international markets and foreign markets because they might have like cheaper costs of production and maybe have higher quality goods. Like for example, in Japan, like if we set really high tariffs against Japanese technology, like, and we don't have really good infrastructure for really high tech domestic technology, then like both our economy will suffer because we won't get access to high quality goods, and second, their economy will suffer because they won't be able to export as much. And like I said in my first one, because the global economy is more intertwined, it'll affect both countries. Also, like another outcome is that like if you have high tariffs on like, so the reason why like an isolationist policy is less favorable than a policy which looks at international economies is because, like, sorry, like, so even if tariffs aren't sent by the central bank, it's still an example of how how domestic policy can affect foreign policy. I have 30 seconds left, so if there's a POI, I'd gladly take it. If not, I'll continue and I won't take any more. Kaylee, POI.
So in a situation where you're only helping yourself by helping other people, even someone who is only concerned with their own self-interest would help those other people. What about a situation in which the central bank and an international government's interests are in conflict?
So as I showed in my first main point is that they do have a vested interest because everything is interconnected, and if they're at a conflict, like, they need to go look past that and see what economic policy can benefit both of them. Like, we're not setting these policies in a vacuum. I could have modeled this, but like they can obviously communicate with other central banks and set exchange rates that like are favorable for both economies. They can set tariffs if that's the thing that central banks do. Or they can, So like these decisions shouldn't be made in a vacuum, and they probably wouldn't be under this model. And global economies can communicate with other central banks and try to figure out the best solution that helps everyone, because overall, if the world economy grows, the domestic economy grows, and you can get access to better goods that you otherwise wouldn't be able to, and like it will increase quality of life because everyone's economy is getting higher. For all those reasons, we're proud to whatever it's called, propose.
Here. Okay, come on, Kaylee.
Show us how it's done.
Huh. Okay, here goes nothing. What we got from opening government today was a world of globalized fairies and rainbows. It's an interconnected world in which it's perfectly possible to find an economic policy in every single situation that benefits every nation involved, and it's just because we don't talk enough that this doesn't happen. We want to give you a slightly more nuanced and realistic picture of the modern world that we live in. We think it's true that economies are, in some sense, interconnected, that they don't exist in bubbles, that a completely isolationist policy that just ignores everything that's happening in the rest of the world is unrealistic. However, we think that this resolution is only important in those scenarios when it's impossible to find a policy that benefits everyone involved, right? Because if there is a policy that benefits everyone involved, even if you weren't explicitly considering the impacts for other economies, you'd still end up doing something that helped them anyways, and this would be a moot point. So they're talking about times when you preference the needs of foreign citizens of foreign economies over the domestic economy, which the central bank is explicitly responsible for. We think this is really flawed and won't actually help the global economy in the ways that they say it will. I'll take you in a minute after I go through my first point. So the first thing that we want to discuss here today is what the purpose of a central bank actually is. And as we all know, because we read the sentence-long central banks have a dual responsibility to, I didn't even write it down well, a mandate to combat unemployment and to limit inflation to acceptable levels within the country that they exist, right? Central banks are national institutions and therefore ought to preference their own domestic citizens. This is how social contracts works. This is how we organize our world today, right? It's into bite-sized national units, and therefore each central bank, each national unit must preference its own citizens and must work for their good. Only after it ensures this can it consider other citizens. And in a time when it is in conflict to consider the benefit of foreign entities and domestic citizens, clearly it ought preference those citizens it was established to protect and to benefit. Yeah, I'll take you now.
So, if in the short term they consider foreign economies and it benefits the foreign economy first, but in the long term it'll have greater economic benefits to the domestic citizens, wouldn't it be in favor of the central bank to benefit the foreigners first and then get greater outcomes later?
Yeah, so Garrett a couple times has basically agreed with our side with this essential line of reasoning, right? We think that the ultimate principle of a central bank ought to be the self-interest of the nation for which it was created. So this means if for some kind of weird situation that you haven't given a concrete example for, it means it would look like it's helping someone else for 10 minutes in order to actually help itself. That's fine. That'd still be consistent with the principles of our side. What you need to argue is that it ought, just for the good in and of itself of helping the world at large, should sometimes prefer foreign entities over domestic citizens, right? That sometimes that's more important. We think it's fine to, in a really pragmatic, self-interested way, think about how things might impact themselves and do the best thing for their own country. That makes total sense, and that's what a central bank ought to be doing. It should not be trying to pursue this kind of impossible fairies and rainbows, perfect economic policy that you seem to be advocating for. So I've talked a little bit about the purpose of a central bank, and now I want to get into the idea that what you propose doesn't actually make sense because it brings in a lot of complicated facets to kind of the administrative proceedings in some ways and just the general work of a central bank for several different reasons. First of all, as I've already argued, sometimes economies are zero-sum games and it's impossible to help everyone in the world. So if you have two competing principles, one where you're trying to help everyone else and one where you're trying to help yourself, at times you will have to choose. We think it makes sense to always preference the self-interest because, again, of the purpose of the central bank that I've discussed. But secondly, we don't think it's clear that we always actually know how to help everyone in the world. It's really clear that the opening government speaker didn't know how to help everyone in the world in terms of an economic policy that we could in fact implement. And even if you were to preference general well-being over this specific domestic national unit, we don't think that it's possible to accurately predict how economies will react. We think that they're kind of living, breathing, evolving units. We think that even the best minds in the world haven't been able to accurately predict how economies will function and will react to certain changes, and so this is kind of an impossible proposition coming out of side government. Furthermore, we think this is outside the expertise of the central bank, right? We think this makes more sense for international collaboration to be something that's dealt with by international economic organizations as opposed to specifically national institutions like central banks. We think that we're just going to end up that central banks that try to pursue this impossible principled kind of policy implementation practices they will end up screwing something up majorly, misunderstanding something, and not only failing to fulfill their responsibility to their domestic citizens, but also potentially setting off catastrophic economic occurrences in the world at large. Finally, we think that this will lead to better international communication. We'll actually have a better shot at achieving the fairies and rainbows that we all hope and dream for. We think that in their world, a central bank would have two competing general goals. One would be to help everyone in the world, and one would be to fulfill its actual duty and help its own citizens. We think that this would really complicate negotiations between governments and between kind of institutions and between economies, because everyone isn't really being, everyone would be confused by these kind of overlapping and contradictory principles that they're using to operate. So if I and Teal, for example, were in a negotiation, it would make a lot more sense and we'd be able to come to a better compromise if we were both straightforward about our own needs, our own wants, and then we could come to something in the middle which would allow for balance, which is just how the negotiations would go down necessarily. I'm over time already. However, if we have all these sort of different principles clouding the issue, it ends up for bad diplomacy and catastrophic economic events all over the world. For these reasons, we are proud to oppose. Thank you.
I thank the leader of opposition for their remarks.
Do you know?
I invite the Deputy Prime Minister to speak. Here, here. I have to put something. You're not going to watch your speech, Alana? No, I don't. Okay. Yeah, can I put your
I don't with that, but
Oh, I see why you want China, Charlotte.
God, my phone always
but you can hit the tariffs.
So I want.
That's a specific thing.
I'm a little taller than Kaylee. Shocking.
Lucky you.
Should I wait for Lana or should I go?
No.
Wait. Oh, did she leave? Where'd she go?
We're not done.
Okay.
You guys done?
No, I'm just getting my stuff.
Oh, you have to leave. Okay, cool.
Yeah. Let's just go ahead, I think.
Cool.
Alana can watch it later.
Yeah, that's true. We're videoing this. Oh, gosh.
God save our souls.
Honorable Speaker, that was a shockingly ill-informed,
What?
devoid of examples, and
Fair.
lacking much of the analysis necessary to prove any of the contentions that side opposition is putting forth. I think that their arguments can be boiled down to essentially the idea that central banks need to be focusing most on their own citizens and that they can't get the kind of international benefits that we're talking about on side government. However, I think that on side government, we can get benefits to our own citizens by considering the international market and considering the way that foreign economies would be impacted. But I also think that even if there is a trade-off, the trade-off would be a very, very small loss to domestic markets and potential massive gains to foreign economies that would benefit billions of people and help them get up out of poverty. And I think that when you're making that comparative, it is a good idea for central banks to at least be considering impacts on other people for a couple of reasons that I'll get into in my speech. So I'm going to start with a little bit of rebuttal, and then the rest of it will be interwoven in my two main points. But the first thing that I want to point out is that the motion explicitly says that central banks should consider the impacts on foreign economies. As my partner told you, we don't need to be enacting any kind of specific policy. We're not telling them to do, like, tariffs or control inflation in a significant way that would harm the domestic economy, like putting a limit on production or something like that. But we think that they should, at the bare minimum, sit down and consider the impact that their actions could have on these foreign markets. Essentially, their side is arguing for isolationist policy, where you're considering only the impacts on your domestic market. But we think that, like, you can't do that in the government, in the international economic climate that we have now, and instead you need to think about the rest of the world. But we think that, like, this isn't just important when there's a trade-off, right? Because there are many, many ways in which having strong economies elsewhere in the world can have extreme benefits for your citizens themselves. Your citizens want cheaper products. They want to have access to more markets and more products that they can buy. And you get that best when you have strong economies around the world where people can have more capital to have more production and be able to develop new innovative technologies that could benefit your citizens a lot. But we also think that their idea about like a social contract to benefit your citizens the most is just not persuasive, especially because like name dropping social contract and not making the argument is never a good way to win a debate round. But we also think that social contracts just like don't exist because you can't opt into your country. You can't really opt out of existing in a country even if it's harmful. And we think that like that's not a good reason to prioritize your citizens, the people in your country, over people in other places. So I think that their idea that this is going to somehow create a catastrophic event does not have nearly enough impact, and I'm not really sure how that would happen. I think that like central banks are probably, after they've considered foreign markets, not going to engage in something that they actively think would cause a collapse of the economy or something like that. But we think that like avoiding thinking about the way that foreign markets could be impacted is something that definitely could cause a collapse if you're not thinking about like the way that economies are interacting. So why is it that we think that this is actually going to end up benefiting the citizens of your country? So we think that this will help because it helps avoid crashes in other areas. So if you look at like things like oil markets where they start up as being very, very strong and profitable, and then over the long term you get things like mass amounts of corruption, you get like falling of dollars like what's happening in Venezuela now where people are carrying money in backpacks instead of wallets, where they, we watched a podcast about it, we listened to a podcast about it in the drive last weekend, then that can cause a lot of really harmful outcomes. It means that you're not able to get the products that you want from countries that now have like mass amounts of unemployment and can't pay their workers. It means that like you're going to have instability in trade, and it also means that you have a lot of political problems that your citizens are going to care about a lot, and that can have impacts on your ability to trade and interact with other foreign entities and foreign economies. We also think that it's beneficial to your citizens that you open new markets and that you have strong economies overall. We think that like one way that like Western countries who have very large and forceful central banks are able to have impacts on developing countries and able to help bring people out of poverty through engaging them in larger economic systems is through having policies that help prevent inflation in large amounts in those areas and helping them develop more employment opportunities. You do that when domestic central banks are engaging in actions that can have impacts on foreign economies. So we think that like when you do that kind of thing, you're able to get products that are cheaper for your citizens. You get more specialized markets because you have places deciding to produce goods that are most specialized to the resources that they have in that area. For example, in China, they have a large amount of citizens. They focus on production and factories and production of goods that people need around the world that they're then able to export. But in some countries like Venezuela, if you have a large amount of oil as a resource, then they're able to specialize and get more efficient production and access the large amounts of oil that are still under the ground that we don't have the technology to access right now. So we think that like your citizens end up being benefited, and they end up having more employment opportunities as well because you have a stronger economy where people are more able to hire more workers, and they're able to pay people more money because it's more profitable and there are more people within the market system who are purchasing products that your workers would be making. But we also think that if there is a trade-off, you're never going to really sacrifice a large amount for your citizens, right? Like you're always going to be making sure that like you're meeting your dual mandate. But we think that if there's a small cost to your citizens, like a percentage fewer people being employed or something like that, if the trade-off is helping people around the world, helping strengthen the global economy, and helping like especially countries that have been massively disadvantaged in the economic markets that are existing now, we think that since there is not really a social contract, and since you have an obligation to help, like, all people, if you have the power to do so without a cost at your mission, we think that you really ought to do so and try to make a difference in curbing massive inflations in other nations and in helping stop massive unemployment rates around the world. Thank you. Very proud to propose.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe.
I don't think it does based on what central banks do, but I don't also really know what they do. So it's fine.
Let's look this up later.
Hey Sam, I'm Teal. We haven't met yet, but I'm excited to meet you. Please enjoy the speech. I don't think I will. Is everyone ready? Order. Point of order.
You can't do that.
Watch me.
I now call the House back to order and invite Teal to deliver the next speech, not to exceed 7 minutes.
Thanks for that. So we think there are like two competing forms of consider that the Gov bench uses in the round. The first is that like they say considering is just that you sit in a room and you think about, I wonder what this will do to another country, and they say that's a good thing. And then the second like interpretation that they have is that consider means that you like vaguely think about that, and then maybe you're like, oh, if I do this central bank policy, then it'll help me in the long run because it like goes through this country and it comes back to another. We don't think either of those forms of like the definition of consider are meaningful in the round. And like the first one just doesn't make sense, and that's unfair because like logically a central bank should be thinking about the ramifications of their actions, but consider should mean that like they meaningfully change their policy around it. So it's not just we understand this will have an impact on next country, but we're going to base our policy off of the impact this has on next country. And then the second part that I think like Kaylee really underscored in the previous speech is that this is necessarily about conflicts, right? So it's possible in all of the rosy pictures that the government bench paints for you, there's no meaningful difference between their side of the house and our side of the house, because they say that the central bank and the nation will be benefited anyway if we consider the impacts on other countries. So there's no meaningful difference between considering it or not, because the central bank will benefit in the long run, which is why we think this motion really, the clash of it is when there's a conflict between this, like the nation that the central bank is in and the interests of another country, that's what we're debating. So like, does this central bank have an obligation to other countries at all? Otherwise, it just doesn't make sense because they do this and they should benefit themselves by helping other countries. So let's go into like some of the pictures that they paint. So like, first off, the world that they create is like really nice and I wish it existed, but it just doesn't. We think especially, and I'd also like to say that a lot of their arguments are couched in terms of things that the central bank has nothing to do with. For example, like tariffs, the 2008 recession, like all of these different things. Like there's not that much, like there's no meaningful engagement with central banks. They just say like all these different, like they wave their hands at it and say like anything to do with foreign countries. But like let's get into some like analysis about central bank specific actions. The first of, and like the point we want to bring you is that really it's a zero-sum game at the end of the day. And like this happens in two ways. Let's say like the central bank increases the amount of money in an economy, which like devalues whatever they're doing. And like through the value of money, they can control how much investment is flowing into their economy. So like that's an impact that has a ramification for other countries. And in that case, that is a zero-sum game. As if an investor is choosing between like the United States and China to invest in which country, if they invest their money in the US because of the value of the dollar, they're necessarily not investing that same money in another country. And I don't think they do enough analysis, or really any analysis, to prove that like that is a meaningful choice that the central bank should consider, helping out China instead of helping out the United States. And the second example of this too is like trade, right? So if a country is able to like sell their products for less or more, then that means that they're competing with another country which isn't able to make the same decision as a result of the central bank's action. So like this is nuanced analysis on why the central bank's ramifications for other countries is a zero-sum game, in which case there's no real reason that they give you to prefer to care about other countries except for the idea that it benefits us to care about the other countries, but we already care about benefiting ourselves. So if, like, simply taking this action, there is no meaningful difference between their side of the house and our side of the house. We also, like, want to bring another argument into this, which is, like, even if they establish we have an obligation to another country, and I guess they kind of do with some work on, like, how it's really arbitrary which country you're going to, then we would argue the central bank is unsuited for the task of helping other countries. Like, they talk about investment in Venezuela and all these other economic policies, but the central bank isn't the institution that provides that. That should be done by, like, the government, like the federal government in terms of what investment it does, international communities, like the International Monetary Fund, all of these other institutions have that responsibility. The central bank doesn't, and we think the central bank is ill-suited to this for two reasons. The first of which is that that's outside of the expertise of the central bank. Like, the central bank's dual mandate is to care about limiting inflation and improving employment and the balance between that. So if they, like, switch their expertise and they're like, hey, we should start caring about, like, what happens in Mexico as a result of this policy, then they'd either have to fire everyone, or the people that they currently have in the central bank wouldn't be able to do that analysis. The second reason we give you is that things already get really complex when you're dealing with things such as the value of money through the supply of it, and that'll only get more complex if we consider not just, like, the outcome right after, increasing or decreasing the amount of money, but a step even further beyond that. So there's, like, this level of complexity that the central bank simply isn't able to deal with, in which case we think it's, like, probably likely that whatever action they take to benefit Mexico will probably backfire, in which case it's a pragmatic reason why, even if we have this obligation, we shouldn't act on it because of these two nuanced reasons.
Last chance!
Sure.
Okay, so if central banks are as selfish as you say they are, wouldn't it still benefit them to fuck over other countries, to have their economy be a bastion of prosperity, to have other countries trade with them, and therefore increase the economy in that domestic country?
So, like, you're saying if we help another country,
No,
then that's
fuck
good
over
for
another
us.
country. You
So-
can fuck over another country.
So we should fuck over another country?
Order!
Yeah.
Order!
No, we only think, like, on our side of the house, you're taking actions that help yourself. They need to argue that you need to at least, like, meaningfully consider a policy change that would help another country in conflict with our own actions, and simply they don't do that. So they, like, characterize, okay, so let's go into, like, I want to sum this up by saying that, like, generally they say the only thing we care about is ourselves. Like, that's the impact they really get to at the end of the day. So they say by considering other countries, we help ourselves. And our primary argument is that that is on the side of our house. Like, we want to help ourselves anyways. And what it means to consider another foreign country and the ramifications there has to be meaningfully different from this. And at the point that you buy that, there's no way that they win the round. And, like, even beyond this, we think there's, like, some analysis that is key to like having this be a real nuanced debate, which is that, like, there is a zero-sum game in the international world, and at the point that you're choosing to benefit another country, you're hurting yourself, and also central banks are unsuited to this complex task for the two reasons I give, and it should be done by someone else instead. Thank you.
I vote not an Econ Motion for trial round.
Yeah, teach us first. Teach us, like,
Okay,
economics
sorry about
first.
that. We promised that we normally are better.